For 2 years, Robert Morrison believed his wife spent her Wednesdays reviewing documents for a consulting firm in Washington. The extra income was good, the routine was predictable, and he had no reason to question any of it. Until the night she didn't come home. And what started as a quiet suspicion of an affair would eventually lead to his wife in handcuffs and the revelation that the woman he'd been married to for 16 years had been living a double life he never could have imagined. On a Tuesday morning in early March 1980, Patricia Ann Morrison left her house in Baltimore at 7:15, just as she had every workday for the past 6 years. She was 34 years old, married for 16 years to Robert Morrison, a regional sales manager for an agricultural equipment company, and she worked as a senior administrative clerk at Convergent Technologies, a defense contractor located in a nondescript office park. The job was stable, the pay was decent, and the work was routine enough that Patricia rarely discussed it at home, beyond general complaints about office politics or the occasional frustration with her supervisor. Robert Morrison was a man of patterns and routines. He left for work at 8, returned by 6:30 most evenings, played golf on Saturday mornings, and spent Sunday afternoons working in the yard or watching whatever game happened to be on television. Their 2 children, Jennifer, 13, and Michael, 11, were navigating the turbulent waters of adolescence with the typical mixture of rebellion and compliance. The Morrisons were like most American families. They attended neighborhood barbecues, paid their mortgage on time, and argued about money with the same frequency and intensity as most middle-class American families in 1980. In late March, Patricia attended a professional conference in Washington, the annual security conference held at the Washington Hilton. It was a 3-day event, filled with panels on emerging technologies, networking opportunities, and the kind of corporate socializing that Patricia generally found tedious but professionally necessary. She returned home on the evening of March 14th with a stack of brochures, a hotel pen, and several business cards from vendors and consultants she had met during the conference sessions. 2 weeks later, on a Wednesday evening in early April, Patricia mentioned to her husband over dinner that she had been contacted about a part-time opportunity. A consulting firm, she explained, was looking for someone with her background to review technical documentation once a week in Washington. The work would require her to take the MARC, Maryland Area Rail commuter train, into the city every Wednesday, spend a few hours at their office, and return home by evening. The compensation, she said, was generous, almost as much for one day as she earned in a full week at Convergent Technologies. Robert asked a few questions. Where exactly was the office? What kind of documents would she be reviewing? Was this something her current employer would approve of? And Patricia answered each one with the casual confidence of someone who had already thought through the logistics. The office was near Union Station. The work involved compliance reviews for European telecommunications standards, nothing that would conflict with her security clearance or her responsibilities at Convergent, and she had already cleared it with her supervisor. Robert encouraged her to take the opportunity. They could use the extra income. College tuition was looming on the horizon, and if Patricia wanted to spend her Wednesdays doing consulting work, he saw no reason to object. Within 2 weeks, Patricia Morrison had established a new routine. Every Wednesday morning, she would leave the house at 9, drive to Penn Station in Baltimore, and board the MARC Penn Line train bound for Washington's Union Station. The commute took approximately 50 minutes. She would return home by 7:30 in the evening, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, depending on the train schedule. And over dinner, she would mention brief details about her day, a difficult client, a particularly dense document, the weather in the city, nothing that invited follow-up questions or seemed anything other than mundane. For nearly 2 years, this routine continued, without interruption. Every Wednesday, Patricia Morrison left for Washington and returned home in the evening. The extra income materialized in their checking account, deposited every other week like clockwork, and while Robert occasionally wondered about the specifics of his wife's consulting work, he never pressed for details. She seemed content with the arrangement, perhaps even happier than she had been before, and the financial cushion allowed them to make improvements to the house, to take a vacation to Florida one summer, to worry less about the mounting costs of raising two teenagers in Baltimore. Robert Morrison was not by nature a suspicious man. He trusted his wife, believed in the fundamental stability of their marriage, and had no reason to question the Wednesday routine that had become as ordinary as grocery shopping or church on Sunday mornings. But trust, even when justified, can become a kind of blindness, and over the course of those nearly 2 years, small moments accumulated in the margins of Robert's awareness, details that meant nothing individually but would later reshape everything he thought he understood about his wife. There were the new clothes, not extravagant, but noticeably more fashionable than Patricia's usual wardrobe, dresses and blouses that seemed designed for somewhere more important than a consulting office. There were the occasional phone calls that would end abruptly when Robert entered the room. The times Patricia would close a notebook or slip a piece of paper into her purse with a speed that suggested something more than absent-mindedness. There were the Wednesdays when she would return home with a certain brightness in her expression, an energy that seemed disproportionate to a day spent reading compliance reports, and the Wednesdays when she returned distant and preoccupied, answering questions with single words and retreating to the bedroom earlier than usual. Robert noticed these things, the way anyone notices the background details of a familiar life, with partial attention and no particular alarm. When Jennifer mentioned once that her mother had come home smelling like cologne, Robert dismissed it as perfume from a department store Patricia must have passed through. When Michael asked why their mother needed to dress up so much for a job reviewing documents, Robert explained that professional settings required professional appearance. The human mind, when confronted with information that threatens established narratives, is remarkably skilled at constructing alternative explanations, and Robert Morrison's mind constructed them without conscious effort, smoothing over the inconsistencies and maintaining the comfortable fiction that his life was exactly what it appeared to be. By the spring of 1982, Patricia Morrison had made more than 90 trips to Washington, had deposited more than $20,000 in consulting income into their joint checking account, and had given Robert Morrison no explicit reason to question the arrangement. But on the evening of May 12, 1982, a Wednesday like any other Wednesday, Patricia did not come home. 7:30 passed, then 8 o'clock, then 8:30. Robert checked the answering machine, thinking perhaps Patricia had called while he was outside, bringing in the trash cans, but there were no messages. By 9 o'clock, he felt the first stirrings of genuine concern. Patricia was never this late without calling, and the train schedule she followed was predictable enough that a delay of more than 90 minutes suggested something had gone wrong. He tried to remember the name of the consulting firm she worked for, realized he had never actually been told the name, only that it was near Union Station. At 9:20, Robert called Directory Assistance and asked for listings of consulting firms near Union Station in Washington. The operator provided 3 numbers, none of which sounded remotely related to telecommunications or compliance review. He called the first number and reached an answering service. He called the second and reached a law office that had closed hours earlier. The third number went unanswered. He tried to remember any detail Patricia had mentioned about the office, the name of her supervisor, the floor of the building, anything that would help him locate her, and realized with growing unease that she had never provided those details, and he had never asked. At 9:45, with no other options occurring to him, Robert called the Mark information line and asked if there had been any delays on the evening trains from Washington to Baltimore. The clerk confirmed that the 6:15 train had experienced mechanical issues and had been delayed approximately 90 minutes. Relief washed over Robert, immediate and profound, followed almost instantly by embarrassment at his own overreaction. Patricia was simply stuck on a delayed train, probably frustrated and uncomfortable, but perfectly safe, and he had worked himself into a state of near panic over nothing. At 10:05 p.m., Patricia walked through the front door, looking tired and irritated. She apologized for not calling, explained that the train had broken down somewhere outside the city, that she had been stuck on it for over an hour. Robert hugged her, told her he had been worried, and mentioned that he had tried to call her office. Patricia went very still for just a moment, then asked which office he had called. Robert explained that he tried directory assistance but couldn't remember the name of her firm. Patricia laughed, a sound that struck Robert as slightly too loud, and said that was because she worked for a small operation that didn't have a public listing, very specialized work, very discreet clientele, nothing that would show up in a phone book. Robert nodded, accepted this explanation, and the evening proceeded normally. They ate a late dinner, watched the end of a television program, and went to bed shortly after 11. But as Patricia fell asleep beside him, her breathing settling into the slow rhythm of unconsciousness, Robert Morrison found himself unable to follow her into sleep. He lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in nearly 2 years, he allowed himself to truly think about the Wednesday routine, to examine it not as a comfortable fact, but as a series of choices and claims that might not fit together as neatly as he had assumed. The consulting firm with no public listing, the generous pay for work that sounded menial, the new clothes and the occasional phone calls that ended when he entered the room, the way Patricia had gone still when he mentioned calling her office, the fractional pause before she laughed and offered an explanation. Small things, all of them easily dismissed individually, but together they formed a pattern that Robert could no longer ignore. He told himself he was being paranoid, that the stress of the evening had made him suspicious without cause, but the thoughts kept circling back, insistent and unwelcome. By 2 in the morning, Robert Morrison had convinced himself that his wife was having an affair. The thought, once formed, could not be unformed. Over the following days, Robert found himself reviewing the past 2 years with new eyes, reinterpreting every detail through the lens of infidelity. The Wednesday routine was not a consulting job, but a regular meeting with another man. The extra income was not payment for document review, but money from some other source. Perhaps a wealthy lover, perhaps something Patricia had saved from her regular salary and deposited strategically to maintain the fiction of outside work. The new clothes were not professional attire, but the wardrobe of a woman conducting a secret relationship. The distant moods when she returned home were not professional frustration, but the emotional complexity of maintaining a double life. Robert Morrison was not a confrontational man. He did not immediately demand the truth or threaten divorce or do any of the things that television and movies suggested a betrayed husband should do. Instead, he made a decision that felt, in the moment, both reasonable and necessary. He would follow Patricia to Washington on her next trip, would observe where she went and who she met, would gather evidence before making accusations. The decision was born not from a desire to catch her in the act, but from a desperate hope that he was wrong, that following her would reveal nothing more sinister than a legitimate consulting job and a series of coincidental details that had been misinterpreted by a tired, anxious mind. On Wednesday, May 19, 1982, exactly 1 week later, Patricia Morrison left the house at 9 o'clock in the morning. Robert Morrison called his office, informed his secretary that he would be out for the day due to a personal matter, and drove to Penn Station in Baltimore. He purchased a ticket on the same MARC train Patricia had boarded, the 9:45 southbound to Washington, and positioned himself in the rear car while Patricia sat in the car ahead. The 50-minute journey felt interminable. Robert kept his newspaper raised, his face partially concealed, and watched through the gap between seats as passengers moved through the aisles, terrified that Patricia would walk back through the car and spot him. But once the train pulled into Union Station and he spotted Patricia going up the stairs, he knew it was his cue to follow. Patricia emerged from Union Station and began walking east on Massachusetts Avenue. Robert followed on the opposite side of the street, keeping approximately half a block behind, trying to appear casual while simultaneously keeping her in sight. She walked for 3 blocks, turned south on North Capitol Street, then turned again onto a smaller side street lined with brownstones and small office buildings. Robert's pulse quickened. This was not the behavior of someone heading to an office. This was the behavior of someone making sure they were not being followed, someone who knew the city well enough to navigate its smaller streets, someone who was being careful. For the next 2 hours, Patricia walked. She stopped occasionally at a shop window, browsed at a newsstand, sat for 15 minutes on a bench in Stanton Park, reading a newspaper. Robert watched from various positions of concealment, a bus stop, a coffee shop, the entrance of a library, and with each passing minute, he became more convinced that his suspicions were correct. No one conducting legitimate business behaved this way. She was killing time, making certain she was alone. At 12:40, Patricia entered Folger Park, a small green space surrounded by row houses and tree-lined streets, and sat down on a bench near the center of the park. Robert positioned himself behind a large oak tree approximately 50 yards away, partially obscured by the trunk but with a clear view of the bench. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Then, at 1 o'clock precisely, a man approached the bench and sat down beside Patricia. He was tall, perhaps in his mid-40s, wearing a dark suit and carrying a newspaper folded under his arm. Robert could not see his face clearly from this distance, but he could see the body language, the way the man sat slightly angled toward Patricia, the way they appeared to be speaking in low voices, the way their heads tilted toward each other in a posture that suggested intimacy or conspiracy or both. Robert felt his stomach tighten, felt the bitter confirmation of what he had suspected, and forced himself to keep watching. The conversation lasted approximately 5 minutes. Then Patricia reached into her purse, withdrew what appeared to be a small manila envelope, and handed it to the man. The man took the envelope, opened it partially, glanced at the contents, and then reached into his own jacket pocket and withdrew a white envelope, which he handed to Patricia. She took it, slipped it into her purse without opening it, and then both of them stood. The man walked north toward East Capitol Street. Patricia walked south toward the park entrance. The entire exchange had taken less than 10 minutes. Robert waited until both of them had left the park, then followed Patricia at a distance as she made her way back to Union Station. She stopped at a bookstore for 20 minutes, browsed a newsstand, had a coffee, and finally entered the station at 5:40. Robert watched from the main concourse as she boarded the 6:15 MARC train back to Baltimore. He boarded the same train, positioning himself in the rear car once again, his heart pounding with the anxiety of being discovered. The 50-minute return journey was tense. Robert sat facing away from the direction Patricia was seated, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the armrests, trying to process what he had seen. An envelope exchanged for an envelope, a brief meeting in a public park. A man in a suit whose face Robert had not clearly seen. It looked like an affair, but something about the exchange nagged at him, something that did not fit the pattern of romantic infidelity. The whole interaction had been too brief, too businesslike, too carefully timed. The train arrived at Penn Station at 7:05. Patricia disembarked and walked quickly to her car in the station parking garage. Robert waited, let her drive away, then walked to his own car several rows over. But instead of driving straight home, he took the longer route through the city, deliberately killing time so that his arrival would seem natural, unconnected to Patricia's return, maintaining the fiction that he had been somewhere else entirely. Robert pulled into the driveway at 7:40 and walked through the front door with the casual demeanor of someone who had spent the day doing exactly what he claimed. Patricia asked where he had been all day. He told her he had met some friends for drinks after work and lost track of time. She nodded, said her day had been fine, uneventful, the usual document review. Robert asked if she wanted to order takeout for dinner. She said that sounded perfect. They ate Chinese food in front of the television, and Robert said nothing about what he had seen, spending the rest of the evening in a fog of uncertainty and growing dread. Over the next 2 weeks, Robert Morrison followed his wife 2 more times. On May 26th, Patricia took the MARC train to Washington, walked through the city for approximately an hour, stopped at a drugstore and a bookshop, ate lunch alone at a sandwich counter near Union Station, and returned home on the evening train without meeting anyone or doing anything that appeared remotely suspicious. Robert followed her on the same train both ways, always positioning himself in a different car, always keeping his newspaper or a book raised to obscure his face. When they arrived back in Baltimore, he let her leave the station first, waited 15 minutes, then drove home. He walked through the door at 8:10, telling Patricia he had been at the driving range, apologizing for missing dinner. On June 2nd, the pattern repeated almost identically. Patricia took the morning train. She walked aimlessly through Washington for hours, met no one, did nothing suspicious, and they both returned on the evening train. This time, Robert made certain to arrive home before her. He left Penn Station immediately after the train pulled in, drove at speeds that made him nervous, and walked through the front door 10 minutes before Patricia would arrive. When she came home, he was already in his house clothes, asking how her day had been. She said it was fine, nothing special, and she retreated to the bedroom to change. Robert began to doubt what he had seen in Folger Park. Perhaps it had been innocent, a chance encounter with an old friend, a colleague from the consulting firm, someone who owed Patricia money and was repaying a loan. Perhaps the whole thing had been a misunderstanding, amplified by his own paranoid imagination, but he could not let it go. The image of the envelope being passed from Patricia's hand to the stranger's hand played on a loop in his mind, and every time he looked at his wife, every time she smiled at him or kissed him goodnight or asked him about his day, he felt the weight of his own ignorance pressing down on him. On June 9th, Robert followed Patricia for the 4th time. The morning unfolded exactly as it had on the previous surveillances. Patricia took the 9:45 MARC train, and she emerged at Union Station 50 minutes later to begin her now familiar pattern of walking through the surrounding neighborhoods. Robert followed, exhausted by the routine, half hoping that nothing would happen, that he could finally dismiss his suspicions and return to the comfortable ignorance that had sustained their marriage for nearly 2 years. Just before 1 o'clock, Patricia entered Folger Park. Robert's chest tightened. She walked to the same bench, where she had met the man 3 weeks earlier, and sat down. Robert positioned himself behind the same oak tree, his heart pounding, and waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Then, precisely at 1, the same man approached the bench. This time, Robert was close enough to see more details. The man was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with dark hair graying at the temples and a lean, angular face. He wore a different suit than before, but carried himself with the same careful posture, the same controlled movements. He sat down beside Patricia, and they spoke for approximately 3 minutes. Then Patricia reached into her purse, withdrew another manila envelope, and handed it to the man. He took it, glanced at the contents, and handed her a white envelope in return. But as the man stood to leave, Patricia's head turned toward the oak tree where Robert was standing. For a fraction of a second, her eyes met his, and Robert saw the recognition flash across her face, immediate and unmistakable. Patricia stood abruptly, said something to the man that Robert could not hear, and the man's head turned toward the tree as well. He dropped the manila envelope on the bench, turned, and walked away quickly, his pace just short of running. Patricia remained frozen for a moment, staring directly at Robert, and then she walked toward him with a deliberate, measured stride that suggested she had already made a decision about what would happen next. Robert stepped out from behind the tree, his legs shaking, his mouth dry, and prepared himself for the confrontation he had been simultaneously dreading and anticipating for 3 weeks. Patricia stopped 3 feet away from her husband, close enough that they could speak without raising their voices, far enough that there was still a gulf between them, physical and otherwise. Her face was pale, but composed, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, almost clinical. She asked how long he had been following her. Robert, caught off guard by the directness of the question, stammered that this was the 4th time. Patricia nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already calculated, and asked why he had not simply confronted her at home. Robert found his voice, asked what the hell she was doing, who that man was, what was in the envelopes. Patricia glanced back at the bench, where the manila envelope still lay, dropped and forgotten in the man's hasty departure, and something in her expression shifted. She looked tired, suddenly and profoundly, as if a weight she had been carrying for years had finally become unbearable. She told Robert to pick up the envelope. He asked why. She said again, more firmly, to pick up the envelope, and then they would talk. Robert walked to the bench, his hands trembling, and picked up the manila envelope. It was not sealed. He opened it, withdrew 3 sheets of paper covered in technical diagrams, dense blocks of text, and what appeared to be circuit schematics. The header on the first page read, "Convergent Technologies, Classified." Robert stared at the pages, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing, and then looked up at Patricia with an expression that was no longer anger or betrayal, but pure, uncomprehending shock. Patricia told him to put the papers back in the envelope and to follow her. She walked out of the park, turned onto a quiet residential street lined with parked cars and empty sidewalks, and stopped beneath the awning of a closed storefront. Robert followed, the envelope clutched in his hand, and demanded an explanation. Patricia took a breath, looked her husband directly in the eyes, and told him that for the past 2 years she had been selling classified documents from Convergent Technologies to Soviet intelligence officers. The man in the park was her handler, or more accurately, one of several intermediaries who collected the materials she provided and delivered her payment. She had been recruited at a conference in March 1980, had begun passing documents in April of that year, and had continued without interruption for 26 months. The consulting job was fiction. The Wednesday trips to Washington were dead drops, or, if she had nothing to pass to her handlers that week, a ruse to preserve her cover story. The extra income in their checking account was payment from the Soviet Union for information that ranged from technical specifications for secure communication systems to project timelines for military contracts to lists of personnel with security clearances. Robert felt the world tilt beneath him. He asked her to repeat what she had just said, certain that he had misheard or misunderstood. But Patricia simply repeated the same information in the same calm, factual tone. She was a spy. She had been a spy for 2 years. The $20,000 that had paid for their vacation and home improvements and Jennifer's braces had come from the Soviet Union in exchange for materials that were almost certainly being used to compromise American defense capabilities. Robert's first coherent thought, emerging from the chaos in his mind, was to ask why. Patricia's answer was simple, almost brutally so. Money. They had needed money, were always going to need money, and when the opportunity had presented itself, she had made a choice. The work was not difficult. The risk had seemed manageable, and the compensation was far beyond anything she could earn through legitimate means. She had rationalized it as a victimless crime. Documents that were probably already known to Soviet intelligence through other channels, information that was valuable primarily because of its classification rather than its content. But as the months had passed and the materials she provided had become more sensitive, the rationalization had become harder to maintain, and she had found herself trapped in a situation she could neither escape nor fully justify. Robert asked if she understood what she had done, if she grasped the magnitude of her betrayal, not just to him, but to the country, to the people whose lives might be endangered by the information she had sold. Patricia said yes, she understood, and that was why she looked so tired, why she sometimes returned from Washington distant and withdrawn, because understanding and stopping were two different things, and she had not been able to stop. They stood beneath the storefront awning for 40 minutes, speaking in low, urgent voices, as the reality of the situation settled over both of them like ash. Robert asked what would happen if he went to the authorities, if he walked into an FBI office and told them everything Patricia had just confessed. Patricia said that she would be arrested, almost certainly convicted of espionage, and sentenced to a significant prison term, possibly life, and that Robert himself might face charges as an accessory if investigators believed he had known about her activities and failed to report them. She asked if he had told anyone about following her, if anyone knew he was here. Robert said no, he had told no one, had made up an excuse at work about a personal matter. Patricia told him they had a choice. They could end this now, could walk into an FBI office and accept the consequences, or they could go home, pretend this conversation had never happened, and continue as they had been. Robert, his mind reeling, asked how she could possibly suggest continuing, how she could expect him to live with this knowledge and do nothing. Patricia pointed out that they had already been living with it for 2 years, that the only difference now was that Robert knew, and that the money would continue to arrive in their checking account every other week, just as it always had. The conversation that followed was not the dramatic confrontation of spy thrillers or the moral clarity of courtroom dramas. It was a negotiation, uncomfortable and grinding, in which Robert Morrison confronted the practical realities of his own complicity and the financial benefits that had accrued from his wife's crimes. Patricia laid out the mathematics with brutal honesty. They had received $20,000 over 2 years, had spent most of it on things they could not have otherwise afforded, and if she continued, they would have enough saved within another year to pay for their children's college education without loans. She asked Robert if he was prepared to explain to his daughter why she could not attend the university she wanted, why their family could not afford what other families in their neighborhood managed easily, all because he had discovered something he could have remained ignorant of indefinitely. Robert understood, in that moment, that his wife was not asking for forgiveness or understanding. She was asking for a decision, a practical calculation of consequences and benefits, and she was framing it in terms that made refusal seem not principled but foolish. He asked how much longer she planned to continue. Patricia said she did not know, that the arrangement had no predetermined end date, but that she would be careful, would take no unnecessary risks, and would stop if she sensed that exposure was imminent. The decision Robert Morrison made in that moment was not born from greed or moral indifference, though both played their parts. It was born from exhaustion, from the recognition that the life he thought he had been living was a fiction, and that the choice before him was not between right and wrong, but between two different kinds of destruction. He could expose Patricia and destroy his family immediately, or he could remain silent and hope that destruction could be postponed indefinitely. He chose silence. They walked back to Union Station together, boarded the 4:30 MARC train to Baltimore, and sat together for the 50-minute journey home. Robert stared out the window at the passing industrial landscape, the rail yards and warehouses and the backs of row houses, and felt something fundamental break inside him. That evening, they ate dinner with their children, watched television, and went to bed at the usual time. Robert lay awake beside his wife, feeling the weight of his decision settle into his bones, and realized that he had become something he had never imagined he could be. Not a hero, but an accomplice. For the next 8 months, the Wednesday routine continued. Patricia Morrison took the MARC train to Washington every week, met with her handlers whenever she had information to pass, and returned home with white envelopes that she converted into bank deposits twice a month. Robert Morrison went to work, came home, played golf on Saturdays, and carried within him a secret that poisoned every interaction with his wife, his children, his colleagues, and himself. They maintained the fiction of normalcy with the same diligence that Patricia maintained the fiction of the consulting job, and for 8 months it almost worked. The mistake, when it came, was small and almost inevitable. In January, a routine security audit at Convergent Technologies flagged an inconsistency in the document control logs. A single page was missing from a file that should have contained 47 pages, and while missing pages were not uncommon in the chaotic environment of a defense contractor juggling multiple classified projects, this particular page had been checked out for copying by Patricia Morrison 2 weeks before the audit. She had signed the log, had returned the file with all pages accounted for according to her own notation, but the physical count did not match the paperwork. The security officer who discovered the discrepancy brought it to the attention of the facility security manager, who in turn contacted the Defense Investigative Service, the agency responsible for investigating security violations at defense contractors. An investigator interviewed Patricia on January 19th, asking routine questions about her document handling procedures, whether she recalled copying that specific page, whether it was possible she had misfiled it or inadvertently left it in a copy machine. Patricia answered calmly, said she did not specifically recall that document, but that she processed dozens of documents every week, and it was possible she had made an error. The investigator thanked her for her time and said the matter would probably resolve itself once the missing page turned up in someone else's file or in the recycling bin. But the missing page did not turn up. A more thorough investigation revealed two additional discrepancies in files Patricia had accessed over the previous 6 months, both involving pages that had been signed out, copied, and returned according to the logs, but could not be located during physical inventory. The Defense Investigative Service expanded its inquiry, began reviewing Patricia's access history more systematically, and on February 3rd, contacted the FBI with a recommendation that Patricia Ann Morrison be placed under surveillance for possible espionage. The FBI opened a case file, assigned a team of counterintelligence agents to monitor Patricia's movements, and within 1 week had photographed her meeting with a known Soviet intelligence officer in Washington, D.C. The arrest warrant was issued soon after, and federal agents arrived at the Morrison home at 6:30 on cold February morning, while Patricia was making coffee and Robert was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table. They identified themselves, read Patricia her rights, and placed her in handcuffs. Patricia Ann Morrison was convicted in federal court in October 1983 of 7 counts of espionage and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Robert Morrison, after extensive cooperation with federal investigators and testimony that confirmed he had only learned of his wife's activities before her arrest, was convicted of misprision of felony and sentenced to 5 years, of which he served 32 months before being released on parole. The Morrison children, Jennifer and Michael, were placed in the custody of Robert's brother in Pennsylvania while their father served his sentence. The row house in Baltimore was seized as proceeds of criminal activity and sold at auction. The $23,000 that had accumulated in the Morrison family checking account over nearly 3 years was forfeit to the federal government. Patricia Morrison served 18 years of her sentence before being released on parole in 2001. Robert Morrison, who divorced his wife while both were incarcerated, died of a heart attack in 2007, never having spoken publicly about the events that destroyed his family. In the end, the Wednesday train that had carried Patricia Morrison to Washington for nearly 3 years had carried her not to a consulting job or an affair, but to a federal prison, and her husband, who had loved her enough to follow her and compromised himself enough to stay silent, had followed her there as well.